It's Ash from Super Videos, back for another video for The Last of Us on HBO. On this video, we're going to be taking a look at some very awesome behind the scenes photos and some epic filming footage. There's a lot of very interesting details that may actually be exclusive for the TV adaptation, things that didn't exist in the video games. And that has to do with some original story for riots at the Fedra base early on during the outbreak. So there's a lot of things to talk about here. Stay tuned, we'll be right back to break it all down. Alright, as always, before we jump into this, smash that like button, subscribe to join our community, and press the bell to be notified when I upload on the channel. Also, all of the links to my sources is down below, so you can go and check it out. But since I live in the city where they're filming The Last of Us, which is in Calgary, Canada, I was able to capture some of these photos myself for everyone to see. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. As I talked about in my previous video, the location that they've been at for the last week is an area in downtown Calgary where there's an older looking building, which they actually turned into a Fedra base. Before we talk about that, another thing that we know at this point is a minor change from the video game, which is instead of Joel and Ellie going to Pittsburgh, they're actually going to be going to Kansas City. We've seen a bunch of Kansas City transit or metro buses in different locations when they were doing some filming for this part of the game, and also the police cars that they used was Kansas City police cars, and obviously the newspaper stands were Kansas City newspaper stands. So there's a lot of things pointing towards this change from the story, which is instead of going to Pittsburgh, Kansas City is where Joel and Ellie are gonna be in the TV adaptation. But this is actually the Fedra base that I was talking about. If you look closely, you can't see it here, but you can see it on some of the other images that I have, which I talked about on previous video. This is a US post office building, or it's supposed to be, obviously, which they turned into the Fedra base at some point early on in the outbreak. But one thing which is extremely interesting is that this particular location changed a few times. There were a lot of things moving and shifting around at different times, which leads me to think that they're going to be filming multiple scenes in this area, scenes that are likely going to be from different timelines. That is important to remember. We'll come back to that in a little bit, but obviously earlier on, this place didn't look quite like this, and one of the key differences was the actual building itself, the entrance. At this point, we can see a lot of black around the windows and the door frame, and obviously the door frame is gone and some of the windows are broken, and of course it looks like there had been some sort of an explosion or fire at some point. Also, look at the military jeep. We can see that there are some black smoke residue on it, so it seems like there had been some sort of a fire or explosion in this area. Earlier on, the doors were actually intact, same with the windows, and there wasn't a lot of this black smoke residue that we see at this point. But other than that, there were a lot of signs around the area, a lot of Fedra signs specifically. There was even this pretty cool sign which said, report signs of cordyceps infection, coughing, slurred speech, muscle spasms, mood change, safety begins with you. So a lot of those kind of safety protocol public messages that we kind of saw in the video game as well. So that's pretty cool. Now there was another sign that was next to this, which was pretty cool. There was a missing cat sign. Now even though this is pretty small and insignificant, I love that quote that they put on there. He is very naive in the ways of this cruel world. And I just thought that was hilarious. I don't know why, but I got a chuckle out of that. Now, another thing that we did talk about on a separate video, but I'm going to repeat it here to kind of connect it to something that came out more recently. So there was this footage where we can actually see some sort of stunt that's happening. This is not an actual active scene. They're just practicing So it's like a practice stunt, but obviously they're lynching this guy, or they're hanging him at least. But it definitely looks like some sort of a lynching ritual. But anyway, obviously, like I talked about on a separate video, I didn't remember any part of the game that resembles this, but looking around a little bit more, I did find a similar scene in the video game. There was one moment in Pittsburgh when Joel and Ellie come across these survivors that are hung on the trees. So that practice stunt that we saw could have been an adaptation of this scene right here. Now obviously the other scene that we looked at was at a Fedra base, but this one wasn't really at a Fedra base per se. So because of that, it's possible that it's different. It's possible that those are two separate things, but we don't exactly know for sure. But with that said, going back to what I said earlier, it looks like they were shifting a lot of the vehicles around in that particular Fedra base location, which makes it likely that we might see a situation where we might see people being hung in a flashback sequence, and then in the current timeline, we can see Joel and Ellie stumbling upon these survivors that have been hung. So leaving out the Fedra elements of things, that could be how everything could potentially come together. With that said, now we're going to talk a little bit about that epic filming footage that I talked about, which again, I didn't capture myself. Same with the practice stunt sequence. I didn't capture that myself either, but this is one of the streets right next to the area where the Fedra base location was. In fact, they were using a few streets near that particular location. So this was a pretty large set location that they had blocked off for filming. But there was a tank in the middle of the road. This is obviously military convoy that belongs to the Fedra. And this is the epic filming footage that I was talking about. I'm just gonna let the video play and then kind of break down what we are actually seeing here and what's going on. Alright, so that was pretty much it. Pretty awesome stuff. Obviously, we see some military vehicles arriving and then what appears to be a riot taking place. Now, what is definitely interesting is that this appears to be earlier on in the outbreak. So that is something to keep in mind. Obviously, those military vehicles that came in were Fedra owned military vehicles, which we're going to take a look at. I couldn't actually make it to them filming this particular scene, even though I wanted to go. I knew they were going to do some filming a few nights ago. I wanted to go, but I couldn't make it. But I did visit set the following day and captured the vehicles that they used for this particular filming sequence. And all of the vehicles that they used were vehicles, or military vehicles I should say, with the Fedra sign on them. So all of these vehicles are vehicles belonging to the Fedra. But obviously we see a riot taking place, and it seems like there are people firing their machine guns up in the air. Now, to me, all of this is pointing more towards a victory celebration rather than a riot, but I could be wrong. Now, you may ask, what's the victory celebration for? I think this group of people are actually the hunters. They're celebrating because they have successfully pushed the Fedra out of the city. And I think the Fedra base that we were looking at is the base that the hunters were able to capture, take control of. And this all obviously also connects to what I mentioned earlier, which is that it appears that there was some sort of an explosion or fire at that Fedra base that we were looking at, which is actually in the background here. So with that, let's take a look at some of the vehicles that they used for filming of that particular sequence. We can see this Fedra Jeep inside of that Fedra base location. So not the streets around, but the Fedra base itself. We can see this military truck that was also there. It was being moved out to a different location or parking spot or something, but this was actually one of the trucks that we saw driving in with all of those people in the back. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is that there were actually 250 extras in that sequence that we looked at. The next photo is a different type of truck that they used for the same sequence. We can obviously see the Fedra logo or sign on the truck. So this is another vehicle that's owned by the Fedra. We can even see this Jeep. Now what is interesting, and I forgot to mention this, in the sequence, we heard people chanting F the Fedra, which obviously also sort of lines up with what I said with that being a celebration when the hunters were able to push out the Fedra. But if you pay attention, it does say F the Fedra on the Jeep as well. Like it's a spray painted message. So I'm assuming that those are also connected to an extent. And then we have another shot of that Jeep right here. And then another one, we can see the FUCK obviously. And then we have this van that was there. This van was pretty cool because it looked like maybe the hunters attacked this particular van at some point because all the windows were busted through and there was a lot of damage on the van itself. But other than that, obviously, we can see the Fedra sign on the van as well. But that's pretty much all of the photos that I took. One final thing that I do want to mention, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier. I apologize if I did. But when it comes to that footage that we looked at with the riot/victory celebration, that was obviously some sort of a flashback, right? And the other footage that we looked at, which was the lynching sequence, that also may have been a flashback sequence. So I wonder if there's going to be some sort of connection with those two. Like the hunters are going to be hanging some of the remaining Fedra soldiers or something to that effect. I could be wrong, but obviously all of this that we're talking about was maybe mentioned at times and kind of referenced, but never fully explored in the video game. So it seems like they're actually changing things up and giving more identity to the hunters and giving us their backstory and giving us a bit more in terms of what they did, how the Fedra was pushed out of the city. But that's pretty much everything. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to join our community, and press the bell to be notified when I upload on the channel. That's it for this video. See you next time for another super video.